Hello and welcome back. Today we'll be discussing a little bit about the Outcast Dead. This one's going to be more than one episode as well, just like the Death Guard lore stuff was. I'd like to thank Phage for pointing me at this book. It's really interesting. It's controversial. It struggles a little bit with timelines, but a lot of the stuff in it is really, really cool. And in this episode, we're mostly going to talk about astropaths because the main character is one, and this book does a great job of digging into not only what it's like to be an astropath, but the Empire's economy around astropaths and its reliance on it. So that's going to be a lot of what we cover today. It's really cool stuff. I also catch myself in a little bit of a rant about the Emperor, specifically around the events of Magnus's folly. So if you're curious about that little foible, you'll get some info around there too, because I just couldn't help myself. And on that note, let's get this party started. This is 0 to 40K. Now, our story begins with the fateful tale of the ship, the Argo. Now, the Argo was cruising through the warp, as human ships do, a very dangerous process, when its Geller fields went down. And Geller fields, if you think about yourself being underwater and having a nice bubble of air around you, the Geller field basically keeps the warp out and the materium in. So while it's up there, as long as you're not under physical attack, all the craziness of the warp stays out and all the goodness of material existence stays on the inside. Well, these fields go down. The ship is assaulted by all manner of demonic stuff, and all but 2 people on the ship are murdered, straight up, and the ship is sort of crushed into still intact, but is nearly destroyed, and miraculously finds its way out of the warp. Now, the 2 people that survive are the ship's navigator, who's a member of the navigator house that owns the ship, and its astropath, this guy, Kai Zulain. Now, the navigator sort of just disappears, and we'll get back to her in a bit, but Kai is recovered and gets a sort of analysis. You know, he's a sanctioned psyker. He's an important asset. He's gone through a ton of training, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And they decide that he's kind of a bit broken, but they're going to send him back to Terra and have him sort of get retrained. Oh, by the way, this is Terra is Earth, and looks pretty cool nowadays, huh? Yeah, it's kind of gross. Astropaths are an essential part of how the Imperium functions. And here we're going to get into a lot of details. Essentially, astropaths, what they do is they can use telepathy kind of across the galaxy. They can tap into the warp, and they can pick up emotions and feelings and messages and symbols and sort of translate those so that humans can communicate with the warp as sort of the network that allows those thoughts to move around regardless of space. If your ship has an astropath, and Terra has plenty of them, though it's quite an effort to acquire a bunch of them, then essentially you have a boat with a radio. It's kind of like what radio did for shipping in our world. The complication, of course, while this is an amazing advancement in technology and allows mankind to communicate while traveling vast distances, they're not just radio waves going through the air or the void of space. They're going through this. That's right, the central hub of communication across the stars for the human race is essentially hell. They're all opening their minds, every astropath, to the warp and transmitting thoughts through it. Now, at this point, any sane person who's not a psychopath should be asking themselves, is it worth it? It's a pretty astronomical question, because what you get out of this usage and reliance on astropaths to travel and communicate, mostly to communicate, the navigators do the traveling part, but you can't talk, you can't really give orders, so you get this cycle. And it's kind of a vicious one. You have these black ships that go out into the Imperium and round up psychers, and the Astra Telepathica grades them, and the ones that are good enough to get the training to become astropaths get that training, which takes a couple decades. It's a pretty horrifying process. People lose their sight, people die, they're shunted with a little piece of the Emperor's grandeur to sort of hold off, stave off some of the pressures of the warp while they communicate. So you've got these black ships going and collecting these astropaths. They get training, then they join this choir or are assigned to ships. The ships go out. Now keep in mind these black ships need to communicate and navigate, so they are consuming up some astropaths in the process. Everybody needs to eat. The ships that are going out and picking up grain and things from, agroplanets, all of these have astropaths. They have to continuously resupply them back home on Terra. There's this big thing called the Choir, which is like 1,000 astropaths with one central super astropath in the middle that is sort of the nexus on Terra of communicating and sorting out all of this kind of janky information being communicated through the warp. So you get this round circle of we need more psychers so that we can have more astropaths, so that we can fill more ships to get more stuff, but those ships require more astropaths, as does Terra, and on and on and on. And the whole time, this place that the Emperor knows is really bad, the warp, is the conduit through which all of this communication is going on. It's kind of crazy.
I do coke so I can work longer, so I can earn more, so I can do more coke, so I can work longer, so I can earn more, so I can do more coke, so I can work longer, so I can earn more, so I can do more, so I can work longer.
Always chasing rainbows.
So I'll betray my age and say that I grew up with a lot of that kind of ad, and immediately when I was thinking about the sort of need for astropaths to make this whole thing work, I immediately started thinking that ad. I'm probably going to grab the I learned it by watching you, Dad ad as well at some point when it comes down to, I don't know, maybe Magnus and the Emperor and all that, but the point stands, and it's not a criticism of the universe. It actually points out like a very important part of how 40K is what it is. There is a near religious deference away from developing technology. You say, hey, this book takes place, during the Horus Heresy. But you got to go like, okay, and yes, there was this dark age of technology, and a lot of it got lost. But like, someone couldn't come around and invent something for interstellar communication that didn't require talking through hell to do it. The warp, excuse me. That's because basically most technology leans very heavily towards weapons of war, and you get like different, Mark versions of battle armor, Space Marine suits, weapons, and all this stuff. But when it comes down to a lot of other sort of what we would consider like menial technology, they take a skull of a real person, put some levitation anti-grav things on it and use that to fly around and cast light on people. It's really interesting, how much progress there is, but then how dependent Terra through the Emperor is on the warp itself, even though he's trying to like hide it from people, and he's desperately trying to squash all religion so that people don't inadvertently pray to the warp thinking they're praying to something else, and that part's noble. The Emperor himself and the empire he's built requires it. Even if you look at when essentially Psyker stuff goes on trial in Nike, I think it's called, and where Magnus gets like a censure. Essentially, the Emperor still says, "Hey, but astropaths and navigators are still cool." It's one of the things that I love the most about this universe is just how unabashedly dystopian it is. Much as the Emperor is trying to work out a plan where travel and communication can happen without the warp, and he's trying to abolish all religion so that people don't accidentally pray to the warp and make it stronger, his pathway to that end goal is literally through the warp. And it's, man, is it grim and dark. He's a victim of his own circumstance, as is humanity. They have alien races to look at that kind of screwed things up a little bit, and I've even walked this path before, but this is the way it works for humanity in this universe. You trade out broad technological advances for centralized control, and I can't remember where I read it from. I think it's in a postscript on one of the books. It's that the core theme of the whole universe is that the center cannot hold, and that's the point of the Emperor, the Imperium, and vis-a-vis that, humanity. It's a big effort, and it's doomed to fail. So we went down that long rabbit hole because the main character of the story, Kai Zulain, is one of these astropaths, and he's survived this terrible near destruction of the ship, the Argo. The only reason he survived is he has a locked-in super chamber that he essentially lives in and does his work in, though he's allowed to leave, so basically could just sit in his panic room while all of this happened, and eventually the ship did make it out of the warp. But you need to keep in mind that he's a very important asset, and he's absolutely traumatized. And when you think about it, he's an astropath, so he's attuned to the warp and psychic communication. So as much as he's stowed away in his little cubbyhole, he can feel the entire crew of the ship being torn apart by, creatures of the warp while it's happening. He can feel the warp closing in. He's experiencing all of these horrifying deaths while being locked in a box. So he's pretty shook, but he survives, and he's an asset, and so he is shipped back to Terra to be analyzed and see if he can sort of be put back together. A lot of his astropath abilities are diminished, and the assessment is that the fear and terror and PTSD that he's had from this experience are blocking out his ability to use telepathy. Kind of like, if you stare at a super bright light for a while, all of a sudden you start seeing, crazy dots and things like that, or anyone who's it's like pulling a muscle. But it's all based on fear and terror and this way closer, in fact, into the warp, exposure to the warp. But it takes a lot to train an astropath, so they bring him back home and they want to see if they can get him ship shape again, because you basically serve the Emperor till you're dead, and he's not dead yet. Now, his therapy doesn't exactly go well, with good reason. Kai is very much traumatized. He's built this place in his mind where he's locked away a lot of the memories and the PTSD, and he feels tremendous guilt, and he's built this sort of fortress in his mind, and he doesn't want to come back. He doesn't want to go on a ship. He doesn't want to communicate telepathically, but all the king's horses and all the king's men are struggling to put him back together again. And it turns out that this sort of lockbox for his traumatic memories will be an asset pretty soon. But while all of this is going on, a very important point in Horus Heresy history is just starting. This is the point of the book where Magnus shows up. He transmits himself through the warp using essentially super astropath powers to try to warn his dad about Horus, the traitor. Now, given when this happens relative to other events that are talked about in the book, this is really the wrong timeline. It's off by quite a bit. We're going to leave the timeliness of it aside, but it's important to discuss. What Magnus does is he basically pushes himself through the warp to try to teleport himself to the Emperor's chamber to warn him directly. And he runs into this sort of wall on the way there, which is the Webway project, which is the Emperor's secret project he's working on, which, yes, is intended to allow humanity to travel and communicate through space without using the warp. But it blocks Magnus. He doesn't really know what it is, and he gets a little help from some other spirit in the warp to push through it, to force his way through, because he urgently wants to tell his dad what's up. Of course, this breaks the webway. This starts letting all sorts of things from the warp into the webway section that is attached to the Emperor's chamber near the throne. It screws everything up. But Magnus didn't know any better, and he meant well. But the Emperor is not pleased, to say the least. And this really is what pushes Magnus, or at least starts to push Magnus, into joining Chaos. It leads down a whole avalanche of different events where the Emperor says, hey, Lehman Russ, another one of his kids, another Primarch, like, go fetch Magnus. So Lehman already didn't like Magnus because he's not big on psychers. So he heads out and flies out into space. And then he runs into Horus along the way. And Horus is like, oh yeah, new orders. Kill everybody. Magnus and all of his legionaries. Because Horus is a traitor. He's like, yeah, let's do this. So, of course, Lehman Russ believes that. We get to a cascading list of events that essentially corners Magnus in the same way that Mortarion was cornered, and he's forced to make a decision to save his legion by siding with Chaos, and he takes that choice. It's the classic case of, the road to hell being paved with good intentions, but there's also like an amazing amount of Imperial, I don't know if hubris is right, I think it probably is, where you have to keep in mind that the Emperor made all the Primarchs. The Emperor is like an amazing genetic scientist. He was like, hey, if I'm going to fight back Chaos, I'm going to make 20 gene-spliced superhumans to lead 20 legions, and I'm going to splice some of my DNA and then throw some other stuff in the mix. So Magnus is not an accident. And yes, the forces of Chaos grab all the little Primarchs from their little test tube babies and throw them around the universe, and they get raised in other places. But it's all like comically apropos places aligned with their genetic makeup. Partially because the game design has that make sense, and partly because it's an interesting twist in how Chaos works. Magnus grows up and has psychic potential and unleashes it, and grows up in an environment where that's possible. And so the Emperor had a hand, maybe not in the place he grew up, but he intended Magnus to be this powerful, to be this kind of psyker. And it's even revealed in a much later book, the volume 1 of what is like the last 2 books of the Siege of Terror. Volume 2 is not even out yet. That it was part of the Emperor's plan for Magnus to be able to sit on the Golden Throne from time to time and keep things in check.
It's yours?
No,
My mother said she found it in your closet.
I don't know. One of the guys
Must have what?
Look, Dad, it's
Where
not...
did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs.
Man, that Emperor is a complicated guy. He's continuously trying to wield the warp to get rid of the warp. He is just out there as a psyker. He uses his powers at will. He genetically created a son who would be a psyker, and then, scolds him and punishes him when he uses abilities, even before Magnus shows up and inadvertently, screws everything up. The Emperor's very complicated, and there's a huge amount of hubris. He thinks that he is humanity's salvation and more importantly, the only person who can separate humanity from the warp. But he's always he's not dipping his toe in it. He's literally wielding it haphazardly the whole time. Anyway, I digress. I should probably just do an episode about the Emperor himself. I have read the book Master of Mankind, and it goes into some pretty thorough depth. But anyhow, what we're left with is when Magnus punches through, it lets a bunch of junk through. He basically cracks a hole that attaches the warp to the Emperor's throne room, and vis-a-vis that, connection to all of the Emperor's super magic toys of technology and warpcraft, which connects to this choir section of the Imperial Palace that reads all of these messages from the warp and outer space. And it's not good. Demons, one of the best ways for them to get through is through psychers. Astropaths are very susceptible, which is why the Emperor sort of shunts a little piece of himself into them to protect them, but this is just too much. And this whole choir room starts getting invaded by the force of the warp. And astropaths just start, by the dozens, burning out like fuses in an old TV, like tubes, dead, bleeding out the eye sockets, bleeding out the nose. And this ball of warp energy starts forming in the middle of this massive choir room, and one of the psychers in charge of Kai's rehab decides to absorb this thing and gets a vision of the future. And Kai's in the room, and this astropath that has been working with Kai knows that Kai has this place in his mind that is held off from all of his psychic abilities. It's like a prison in his head, wrapped up with all of his PTSD. And so this other astropath touches Kai on the forehead and stashes this precognitive vision in that lockbox to sort of stow it away before they die from all of this power from the warp. So essentially, Kai now has this prophecy that he can't get to in his head, locked away in a sort of perfect place, hopefully for eternity. Of course, dozens of people see this go down, and when things finally simmer down a bit, the choir's pretty much wrecked. Terra's not receiving radio messages anymore for quite a while. Countless astropaths are dead. There's fighting going on. There's actually a security force that is just around, these really badass dudes that are just around to take care of business whenever a psyker loses it and gets taken over by a demon. So there is security in there, and they're pretty brutal. But when things simmer down, the problem is a bunch of people saw this other psyker tap Kai on the forehead, and so the Imperial forces grab Kai and they lock him up. And they start interrogating him. They want to know what this ball of light thing was. Congratulations, Kai, you're going to Alcatraz. Well, not really Alcatraz, but it's an underground prison. It's sometimes called the Vault. I think its official name is Kangba Marwu. It's somewhere on this map, I assume, somewhere. This is sort of the Imperial City. He's shuffled down there. This is a place that is run by the custodians. It's maximum security. It's intended to hold psychers. It's got all kinds of security measures to it. and he's going to get locked in there with some other interesting characters from something called the Crusader Host. Now that's where we'll wrap up this episode for now. It's pretty much the end of Act 1 of the book. We've learned a ton about astropaths and the astropath economy, and a bit about the relationship between Magnus and the Emperor. In the next episode, Act 2, we'll go into these guys, the Crusader Host. They're actually they're Astartes from a variety of legions that are for some reason in prison, and you can tell from that picture they don't exactly look like they're in prison anymore, and they don't exactly look like they're wearing power armor. So we'll see where that goes next time. I appreciate you hanging out, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.